What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of your life? It's one of the oldest questions human beings have ever asked, and we seem almost incapable of accepting the possibility that the answer might be nothing. We want our lives to matter. We want to believe that our birth happened for a reason, that our struggles have a purpose, that the people we love were meant to enter our lives, that the things that happen to us form a story. And perhaps most of all, we want to believe that our existence matters to the universe. But here's a strange question. Have you ever wondered about the meaning of a dog's life? Not what makes the dog happy. Not whether the dog has a purpose within your family. I mean, what is the cosmic meaning of that dog's existence? What about a whale, an ant, a tree, a beetle, a bacterium? There are millions of species on this planet, and yet we seem particularly determined to find a grand purpose for one species, us. Perhaps that tells us something. Perhaps the search for the meaning of life isn't really about discovering what the universe wants from us. Perhaps it's about our inability to accept that the universe may want absolutely nothing from us. Human beings are extraordinary pattern-making creatures. We see shapes in clouds, faces in random objects, patterns in stars, connections between unrelated events, and we do something else. We turn those patterns into stories. If something good happens, we call it luck. If something terrible happens, we ask why. If two people meet by coincidence and eventually fall in love, we may say they were meant to meet. If someone survives an accident, we say perhaps they were meant to live. But what happens when they don't survive? What do we say then? That perhaps they were meant to die? That their purpose was completed? Or that there was a plan we simply weren't capable of understanding? Notice what we're doing. We're taking events and building a narrative around them. And I suspect one reason we do this is because randomness is psychologically uncomfortable. If our existence has no purpose, then we face a frightening possibility. Perhaps we aren't special. Perhaps nothing was waiting for us. Perhaps nobody wrote the script. And perhaps we aren't the main characters. Religion has provided perhaps the most powerful answer to the question. Your life has meaning because it was created for a purpose. You're here because God intended you to be here. Your actions matter. Your choices matter. Your suffering matters. And death isn't necessarily the end. And for many religious traditions, earthly existence is only part of a much larger story. There may be a heaven, judgment, paradise, reincarnation, eternal life, a continuation of existence beyond death. And there's something psychologically extraordinary about this idea. It takes the terrifying uncertainty of life and turns it into a story. Birth is the beginning. Life is the test. Death is the transition. Eternity is the destination. Suddenly everything has a place. The tragedy has a reason. The suffering has a purpose. And death becomes not an ending, but a doorway. I understand why this idea is so powerful, but there's another possibility. Perhaps the story exists because we need the story, not because the universe provided one. Look at the rest of life. An elephant doesn't appear to spend its evenings wondering, what is the meaning of my existence? A dog doesn't seem tormented by the possibility that it has failed to fulfill its cosmic purpose. A whale doesn't seem worried that it hasn't found its destiny. A tree doesn't look at the forest and ask, why am I here? Of course, animals have goals. They seek food, avoid danger, raise offspring, find shelter, protect their territory. Some species demonstrate astonishing intelligence and social complexity, but we have no compelling evidence that they are troubled by the philosophical problem of existence in the way humans are. And perhaps that is because the problem isn't existence, it's consciousness. Once a creature becomes capable of imagining its own future and remembering its past, it can begin to ask why. Why am I here? Why will I die? What happens afterwards? And perhaps the human brain's greatest gift is also its greatest burden. We can imagine a purpose even when there may be none. This is where chaos theory becomes interesting. Chaos theory isn't the claim that everything is meaningless and completely random. Quite the opposite. Chaotic systems can follow mathematical rules, but extremely small changes in internal conditions can produce dramatically different outcomes. The famous metaphor is the butterfly effect. A tiny difference at the beginning of a process can eventually lead to enormous differences in what happens later. And human life is filled with events like these. You miss a train. You meet somebody on the next one. That person introduces you to someone else. You move to another city. You take a different job. You have a child. That child grows up and makes another decision. And suddenly your entire family history is different because you were 5 minutes late one morning. We look backward at all of this and construct a story. This happened because that happened. And sometimes there really is causation, but causation isn't the same thing as destiny. The fact that events form a chain does not mean the chain was planned. A river has a course. That doesn't mean the river had a destination in mind. And perhaps human existence is similar. A vast chain of causes, conditions, accidents, decisions, and coincidences, which we only recognize as a storyline because we're looking backward. Now we reach the hardest part of this argument. If every human life has a predetermined meaning, what happens when someone dies at 2 years old? What was the meaning of that life? What about someone who dies in a car accident at 20? Someone murdered at 30? Someone killed by a disease before they even had the opportunity to discover what they supposedly came into the world to accomplish? We can always invent an explanation. Perhaps their purpose was to affect somebody else. Perhaps their short life changed another person's life. Perhaps there was a lesson. Perhaps it was part of a divine plan. But notice what we're doing. We're creating meaning after the event. We're taking tragedy and constructing a story around it. And perhaps that story helps us cope. Perhaps it is necessary. But comfort isn't evidence. A tragedy can be meaningful to us without having been deliberately designed for us. That distinction matters. There is another possibility that we don't like to consider. Perhaps the belief that our lives have some grand cosmic purpose is a little bit narcissistic. Think about the scale of existence. There are billions of human beings alive today. There have been billions more before us. There are millions of other species sharing the planet. And the universe contains billions of galaxies. Yet we look at all of this and somehow conclude our lives must have a special meaning. Why? Because we are intelligent? Perhaps. Perhaps we can think about existence? Certainly. But intelligence doesn't automatically create cosmic importance. A calculator can perform mathematics. That doesn't mean mathematics exists for the calculator. A bird can navigate thousands of miles. That doesn't mean migration was designed specifically to give that bird a purpose. And humanity's ability to ask what life means doesn't necessarily mean that life has an answer. Perhaps we're simply the species capable of asking the question. Think about your own life. You can tell a story about it. You were born here, you met this person, you lost that person, you made this decision, you took that job, you moved there, you became this version of yourself. And because the story has already happened, it feels inevitable, but it wasn't. At every point, there were alternatives. You could have turned left. You could have said no. You could have stayed home. Someone else could have made a different decision. A storm could have arrived earlier. A car could have been traveling slightly faster. A stranger could have walked into a cafe 5 minutes later, and your story would be different. This is one reason I find the concept of destiny so difficult. Destiny makes the ending appear to have existed before the beginning, but perhaps the truth is much simpler. The beginning happened, then something else happened, then something else, and we call the accumulated result our life. Now someone will quite reasonably ask, if life has no meaning, does anything matter? I would argue that this gets the question backwards. A sunset doesn't need to have a cosmic purpose to be beautiful. A meal doesn't need to last forever to taste good. Friendship doesn't need to have been ordained by destiny to be real. And love doesn't become less valuable because it eventually ends. In fact, perhaps the opposite is true. If life has no predetermined meaning, then the meaning we create becomes more important. You can decide to make your life about your family, or your work, or art, or kindness, or adventure, or learning, or simply enjoying the astonishing experience of being alive. These things don't need cosmic approval. They only need to matter to you and to the people whose lives you touch. The universe doesn't have to care about your life for your life to matter to another human being. And so we arrive at the uncomfortable conclusion. Perhaps there is no meaning of life. Not because life is worthless, but because meaning was never there to begin with. Perhaps there is no destiny, no predetermined purpose, no cosmic storyline. No invisible author deciding who will meet whom, who will live, who will die, who will suffer, and who will prosper. Perhaps existence simply happened, and then life happened, and eventually consciousness happened, and consciousness looked at all of this and asked, why? And because human beings hate unanswered questions, we invented answers. Religions, destiny, fate, purpose, cosmic plans. Perhaps these ideas have helped humanity survive the terror of uncertainty, and perhaps they are stories rather than discoveries. And I would argue that there is something strangely liberating about accepting that, because if there's no universal meaning, you are free. You don't have to fulfill a destiny. You don't have to justify your existence to the universe. You don't have to discover the reason you were born. You simply have to live. There are millions of species on Earth, each struggling to survive, each following its instincts, each occupying a tiny piece of this enormous and extraordinary planet. And perhaps we're not the center of it. Perhaps our lives aren't more important than the life of a whale, or a bird, or an insect, simply because we can ask what our lives mean. Perhaps the greatest act of humility is accepting that there may be no answer, no grand purpose, no destiny, no meaning, just existence. And perhaps that is enough, because if there's no meaning of life, then we have something extraordinary. We get to choose what life makes meaningful to us. And maybe that's better than having the answer handed down from someone else. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys questioning the assumptions we often take for granted. And tell me in the comments, do you believe life has a meaning, or do we create the meaning ourselves? Until next time, keep questioning.